Okay, so now we are going to take a look at what happened to the western part of the Roman Empire after its decline. So let's understand what is known as the migration period. It's also known as the period of quote unquote barbarian invasions, or the Völkerwanderung, the Völkerwanderung, the migration of peoples in German. It was a period of intensified human migration in Europe from about 400 to 800 AD during the transition from late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. This period was marked by profound changes both within the Roman Empire and beyond its frontier. And the migrants who came first were Germanic groups such as the Goths, Vandals, Angles, Saxons, Lombards, Suebi, Frisi, and Franks. And they were later pushed westward by the Huns, Avars, Slavs, Bulgars, and Alans. But it was the Merovingians, who were a Salian Frankish dynasty that came to rule the Franks in a region known as Francia in Latin. For 300 years, from the middle of the 5th century, their territory largely corresponding to ancient Gaul, as well as the Roman provinces of Rhaetia, Germania Superior, and the southern part of Germania. The Merovingian dynasty was founded by Childeric I. He was the son of Merovich. He was the leader of the Salian Franks, but it was his famous son Clovis, who ruled from 481 to 511, who united all of Gaul under Merovingian rule. So the Merovingian dynasty owes its name to the semi-legendary Merovich. He was the leader of the Salian Franks. The Merovingian family were sometimes referred to as the long-haired kings, because their long hair distinguished them from the Franks, distinguished them among the Franks, who commonly cut their hair short. Now, after the death of Clovis, there were frequent clashes between different branches of the family, but when threatened by its neighbors, the Merovingians presented a very strong united front. During the final century of Merovingian rule, the dynasty was increasingly pushed into a ceremonial role. The Merovingian rule ended in March 752 when Pope Zachary formally deposed Childeric III, and Zachary's successor, Pope Stephen II, confirmed and anointed Pepin the Short in 754, beginning what is known as the Carolingian monarchy. Charles Martel was a Frankish statesman and military leader who, as Duke and Prince of the Franks and Mayor of the Palace, became the de facto ruler of Francia from 718 until his death. The illegitimate son of the Frankish statesman Pepin of Herstal and a noblewoman named Alpaida, Martel successfully asserted his claims to power as successor to his father as the power behind the throne in Frankish politics. Continuing and building on his father's work, he restored centralized government in Francia, and he began a series of military campaigns that reestablished the Franks as the undisputed masters of all Gaul. And in all foreign wars, Martel subjugated Bavaria, Alemannia, Frisia, and vanquished the Saxons and halted the Islamic advance into Western Europe at the Battle of Tours. Martel is considered to be the founding figure of the European Middle Ages. He was skilled as an administrator and warrior. He is credited with a seminal role in the development of feudalism and knighthood. That's why I'm wearing the shirt by Monty Python. It's just a flesh wound. Martel was a great patron of Saint Boniface, and he made the attempt at reconciliation between the papacy and the Franks. The Pope wished him to become the defender of the Holy See and offered him the Roman consulship, but Martel refused the offer. Although Martel never assumed the title of king, he divided Francia like a king between his sons Carloman and Pepin. And the latter became the first of the Carolingians, the family of Charles Martel, to become king. Martel's grandson, Charlemagne, extended the realms to include much of the West and became the first emperor since the fall of Rome. Therefore, on the basis of his achievements, Martel is seen as laying the groundwork for the Carolingian Empire. Pepin the Short, also known as Pepin the Younger, was the king of the Franks from 752 until his death. So he was the first of the Carolingians to become king. The younger son of Frankish strongman Charles Martel, Pepin's upbringing was distinguished by the ecclesiastical education he had received from the monks at Saint Denis. And being well disposed towards the church and papacy on account of their ecclesiastical upbringing, Pepin and Carloman continued their father's work in supporting Saint Boniface, in reforming the Frankish church, and evangelizing the Saxons. After Carloman, who was an intensely pious man, retired to religious life in 747, Pepin became the sole ruler of the Franks. And as king, Pepin embarked on a very ambitious program to expand his power. He reformed the legislation of the Franks, and he continued the ecclesiastical reforms of Boniface. Pepin also intervened in favor of the papacy of Stephen II against the Lombards in Italy. He was able to secure several cities, which he then gave to the Pope as part of the donation of Pepin. This formed the legal basis for the papal states in the Middle Ages. Pepin died in 768, and he is going to be succeeded by his sons Charlemagne and Carloman. Although unquestionably one of the most powerful and successful rulers of his time, Pepin's reign is overshadowed by his more famous son, Charlemagne. So it is Charlemagne, also known as Charles the Great or Charles I, who was the king of the Franks from 768, and then he became king of Italy from 774, and then from 800, he becomes the first emperor in Western Europe since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire 3 centuries earlier. So the expanded Frankish state he founded is called the Carolingian Empire. He was the oldest son of Pepin the Short and Bertrada of Laon. Charlemagne became king in 768 following the death of his father. He was initially co-ruler with his brother Carloman I, but Carloman's sudden death in 771 under unexplained circumstances left Charlemagne as the undisputed ruler of the Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne continued his father's policy towards the papacy and became its protector, removing the Lombards from power in northern Italy and leading an incursion into Muslim Spain. He also campaigned against the peoples to his east, Christianizing them under penalty of death, at times leading to events such as the massacre of Verdun. Charlemagne reached the height of his power in 800 when he was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day at Old St. Peter's Basilica. Charlemagne is called the father of Europe because he united most of Western Europe for the first time since the Roman Empire. And his rule spurred what is known as the Carolingian dynasty. This was a period of cultural and intellectual activity within the Catholic Church. Both the French and German monarchies considered their kingdoms to be descendants of Charlemagne's empire. Now, Charlemagne died in 814, having ruled as emperor for just over 13 years. He was laid to rest in the imperial capital of Aachen in what is today Germany. And it is his son, Louis the Pious, that succeeded him. Louis the Pious is also called the Fair and the Debonair, and he was the king of Aquitaine from 781. He was also the king of the Franks and co-emperor with his father, Charlemagne, from 813. And as the only surviving adult of Charlemagne, He became the sole ruler of the Franks after his father's death in 814. This was a position that he held until his death. During his reign, Louis was charged with the defense of the empire's southwestern frontier. He conquered Barcelona from the Muslims in 801, and he asserted Frankish authority over Pamplona and the Basques south of the Pyrenees in 812. And as emperor, he included his adult sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis, in the government and sought to establish a suitable division of the realm amongst them. Now, Charlemagne's greatness is threefold: his military exploits, his relationship with the church, and his Renaissance. Now, first, the reason why we entertain Charlemagne is because his military conquests established him as the sole ruler of a vast empire, including Lombard Italy, Saxony, and Central Europe. And most importantly, he exercised control in Northern Europe and even across the Pyrenees. So his conquest of Saxony helped forge his reputation as a Christian king, and the church was quick to align itself to him. And he took his Christian responsibilities very seriously. And he acted as a leader of Christendom, enforcing the religion and extending his services as the sword arm of the church. He was active in church reform. He united himself with the proactive popes as a secular and religious force. And this is key because his Renaissance was one of the most remarkable achievements. Already enjoying a firm and stable agricultural and economic base, Charlemagne added to his wealth by the influx of tribute from the conquered lands and from the court revenues that he gathered from his newly designed system of courts and local administration. His new coinage system made it possible to compete on an international market, and he reintroduced France to the international economy. The system for Charlemagne was far from perfect, and corruption was common, but the amount of income was great enough to allow Charlemagne to pursue grand building projects, establish schools, and promote the production of art, architecture, and literature to a level that was previously unseen in Northern Europe. Now, something's going to happen that is going to change the situation in Europe, and that is what is known as the invasions. Okay, beginning in the 9th century, another series of invasions are going to threaten Europe. And much like the 5th century invasions that threatened the Roman Empire, from the north, in Scandinavia are going to come a new group, the Vikings. And the Vikings are going to travel from across the Baltic Sea in these shallow draft longboats. And the Vikings were mainly pirates, interested in quick strikes and easy fights. So they targeted Christian monasteries first, then small villages, and then towns. And from across the central steppes of Asia and Central Europe come the Magyars. And these groups terrorized Central Europe until they collectively defeated the German Holy Roman Emperor Otto I at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955. And finally, the last groups of the 9th century invaders were Islamic forces, which periodically raided the southern coastline of Europe. So in the map, you can see the different invasions of Europe, where you see the arrows pointing to the different groups coming in. But these invasions or raids had several effects. They isolated communities by discouraging travel. Trade declined as people grew fearful of traveling. The invasions also weakened the authority of the kings, who appeared unable to protect their people and territory. And finally, the most important lasting impact was the development of a system of feudalism, which lasted in various forms across Europe for hundreds of years. Now, the feudal system was based on a series of mutual obligations. In exchange for military protection and other services, a lord or a landowner was granted land called a fief. And the person receiving a fief was called a vassal. So feudalism depended on the control of the land. Now, a vassal swore an oath to be faithful and to serve his lord amongst all others. However, a lord didn't have complete power over his vassals. Now, Charlemagne ruled that if a lord tried to kill a vassal, take his land, steal his wife, steal his daughter, fail to defend him, or make him a serf, the vassal was no longer obliged to serve the lord. So in feudal Europe, nobody truly owned the land because the king ultimately was a vassal to God. And the king's fief was believed was a gift from God for being a wise ruler. Nobles were vassals to the king. The king gave them land in exchange for services. Nobles then turned around and granted smaller fiefs to lesser nobles, and then so on and so on. And ultimately, at the bottom were the tenants. This is the key. These are the peasants. They held very small pieces of land from minor lords in exchange for services or rent. So the structure of feudal society is well expressed in the phrase, no man without a master, no land without a lord. Hence where you get the term today, landlord. The feudal pyramid, as you can see in the pictures, often became a very complex tangle of conflicting loyalties because both lords and vassals are going to try to use their relationships to their own advantage. And at the peak reigned the king. Next came the most powerful vassals, wealthy landlords such as landowners such as nobles and bishops. And then serving beneath these vassals were knights. Now, knights were mounted warriors who pledged to defend their lords in exchange for fiefs. And at the base of the pyramid were the majority of the people, the landless peasants who toiled in the fields. So you have the kings, the nobles and the bishops, the knights, and the peasants. Obviously, you should understand that this is the game of chess today, or a deck of cards, where you have the commoners and the elite, the jacks, jokers, and kings, queens, jacks, and jokers, wild, the commoner class, or the chess game. So very important. So when we take a look at a social class was inherited. Since the medieval era, it was understood that there's those who fight, those are the nobles and the knights. There are those who prayed, the men and women of the church, and then, of course, the majority, you had to work. And those were the peasants. And in Europe, since the Middle Ages, the vast majority of the people were peasants. And most of the peasants were serfs. Serfs were people who could not lawfully leave the place where they were born. Though they're bound to the land, serfs were not slaves because the lords could not buy or sell them. The wealth of the feudal lords came from the labor of the peasants. So, the manor. The manor was the lord's estate. And since the Middle Ages, the manor system was the basic economic arrangement. The manor system rested on a set of rights and obligations between a lord and his serfs. The lord provided the serfs with housing, strips of farmland, protection from outside interference, from the invasions. In return, the serfs tended the lord's lands, cared for his animals, and performed other tasks to maintain the estate. Peasant women shared in the farm work with their husbands, but all peasants, whether you be free or serf, owed the lord certain duties, and these included at least a few days' labor each week and a certain portion of their grain. Peasants rarely traveled more than 25 miles outside of their own manor. So if you stood in the center of a plowed field, a peasant saw their entire world. They couldn't leave it. And usually a manor only covered a few square miles of land. It typically consisted of the Lord's manor house, of a church, and workshops. Now, generally, 15 to 30 families lived in the village on a manor. Fields, pastures, and forests surrounded the village, primarily because Europe is in a temperate zone. Sometimes a stream wound through the manor, and streams always provided fish, which served as an important source of food. So, the manor was a very important self-sufficient community. The serfs and the peasants raised or produced nearly everything that they and their lord needed for daily life. Crops, fuel, cloth, leather goods, lumber. The only outside purchases were salt, iron, and a few unusual objects, and most important were the millstone. These were huge stones that were used to grind flour. So for the privilege of living on the Lord's land, the peasants paid a high price. They had to pay a tax on all grain that was ground on the Lord's mill. Any attempt to dodge these taxes by baking bread elsewhere was treated as a crime. Peasants also paid a tax on marriage. Weddings could only take place with the Lord's consent. And after all these payments to the Lord, the peasants then owed the village priest a tithe or a church tax. A tithe represented 1/10 of their income. So when we take a look at peasant conditions, they lived in crowded cottages with 1 or 2 rooms. They warmed their dirt floors by bringing pigs inside. At night, the family huddled on a pile of straw that often crawled with insects. But the peasants' simple diet consisted mainly of vegetables, coarse brown bread, grain, cheese, and soup. In fact, only the elite ate meat, and they ate meat based on ceremonial hunts. So, in conclusion, the majority of the people living under the chaotic conditions of these invasions owned very little outright. Usually a family had a few animals, pigs, hens, or a cow. Some of them owned tools such as a hoe or an axe, a spade, or a barrel. Wealthier peasants owned maybe a few more household items. Peasants usually shared their cottages with their farm animals for the animals' safety. A small fire used for cooking and warmth was kept burning in the center of the cottage. There was no chimney, and the smoke left the cottage through a hole in the roof. And it was through warfare. And warfare is important because that's what it was all about. War, war, war. The feudal lords defended their estates. They seized new territories, and they increased their wealth. The lords and their families, the lords and their armies, lived in a violent society that prized combat skills. So, in the vulgar Latin, this is the legacy of Rome. In the vulgar Latin, this is the legacy, the violence that we have inherited. So now you are ready for the documentary film that follows this presentation. Thank you.